My name is Heather Feather. I am the owner of Rare Bird Medicine, and today's topic is autism versus PTSD. I think once I've used notes in all the videos that I've made, but I'll be using notes today just because I want to make sure I cover all the points. There's a distinction between PTSD and complex PTSD. If you don't know, my dear friend Magnolia taught me this a year or two ago, and I was just always like, I got PTSD, but I actually have complex PTSD. And I just wanted to flush up this distinction real quick. Just that complex PTSD is where you have a multitude of traumatic events, or you have a recurring and repetitive traumatic event, like repetitive sexual assault experiences or physical abuse from a family member for years and years. And that actually can influence the psyche in a way that long-term practices may be needed to get to a healed state from the repetitive trauma or wide variety of traumas one has faced. Whereas PTSD is a singular traumatic event, and that is the first key point of a distinction between PTSD or complex PTSD and autism. PTSD, a traumatic event, is present. Doesn't mean that if you have autism or neurodivergence that you do not experience traumatic events. People with autism and neurodivergence are 3 times more likely to be sexually assaulted because they don't get neurotypical social cues. And my experience with neurodivergence is you tend to be very trusting. You just like, and I've seen this in videos I've watched. It's just like, no, you just keep trusting. And then it's like, oh, that was not pleasant. You're like, oh. And it just does, that trust really never goes away. But so with PTSD specifically, there's a presence of a traumatic event, and that may lead to avoidance behaviors, which is typically specific to PTSD and complex PTSD. I think, having neurodivergence, I can avoid social interactions. So there can be some components of that in the other, but it's listed specific to being a PTSD response. And there can be intrusive memories and flashbacks. So I've been in plenty of board meetings, plenty of grocery stores where a memory of being assaulted or being in a car accident or my mom dying in a car accident or any of the stuff that I've experienced, like my ex hanging himself, whatever that is, I literally will have this thing flush up of him hanging, and then I'm trying to do the board meeting and I'm trying to do the grocery shopping, but I can't stop the image of him hanging in my head, and I can't get it out, and I can't stop thinking. Then that leads to like, what could I have done differently? What could I have said differently? How could I have had this be differently? There's nothing different I could have done, but it doesn't necessarily keep me from thinking about that ad nauseum throughout the life. And finally, with PTSD and complex PTSD, you can have nightmares because you had a traumatic event that might filter through the subconscious mind to try to kind of resolve or assess or deal with that issue through the dream time at night. There are several qualities that are true of both PTSD and autism. And so sometimes getting an autistic or neurodivergent diagnosis can be difficult because it's like, well, if you've had trauma, then, well, maybe it's just PTSD. I've received that a lot. So you might avoid certain stimuli, and that's true for somebody that's neurodivergent or with PTSD. It's like, with autism and neurodivergence, I often see that as like, I don't like the way velvet feels, or I don't like the way this tag feels on my shirt, or like, I don't do that. Like, because you have special interests, which is specific to autism, you might not also want to get involved with stimuli that isn't in your interest. It's like, that doesn't interest me. I don't want to hear about it, see about it. It's one of the great challenges of being neurodivergent is how do I get out of a conversation when people are talking about things that don't interest me at all? This is not interesting, and why do I have to be a part of it? But as a general rule with PTSD, you might avoid certain stimuli because it overwhelms, your nervous system is already overwhelmed from the trauma, and you just don't want to be part of it. Dissociation, so being dissociated from the self. My experience with neurodivergence is that dissociation typically happens more in a very inward way where you can go really deeply kind of almost be hidden within your own self. And so I feel like that's a lot more internalized in neurodivergence. With PTSD and complex PTSD, that feels more like for me, has been more of an out-of-body experience where I go out of body and I literally dissociate with being Heather. And I'm not even like, because that's what I did in the trauma points, I exited the body. And so many will astral travel at trauma points, and you might be very disconnected from like the self and the body. You may have increased risk of victimization, like I mentioned. People with neurodivergence and autism have 3 times greater likelihood of being sexually assaulted, and it's because they don't get neurotypical social cues, which is autism-specific quality. But also, if you've been a victim, mathematically, the likelihood that you will be assaulted or be a victim again it increases exponentially. And then if you have another assault, that mathematically increases again, that you will have another victimization. It's almost like criminals can smell a victim out. They can snuff it out. And I've seen it. I've seen like people, it's like, and I think that's part of being neurodivergent too. It's like criminals can just sense that you're just like trusting. My experience with autism and neurodivergence is there's a lot of trust present. I still have a ton of it after 5 decades of a whole bunch of foolishness from a whole bunch of two-leggeds. It's a miracle. That's a miracle, everybody. You might have really negative beliefs of the self or negative beliefs of the world. You might have a hard time loving yourself. I know after I lost my virginity to rape at 12 or 13, I decided to flirt with being anorexic. And I was like, I blame myself for not fighting back. I blame myself for not stopping myself from, there was a whole long story that goes with it, but for not stopping myself on the journey that took me to the place in which I got assaulted. And so I wanted to punish myself. And so a lot of times with PTSD, a lot of times after a traumatic event, if you're being abused by your parents, you might self-harm, you might abuse the self, you might self-cut. That's one of the other things. High rates of substance abuse, depression, self-harm, and suicidal ideation is true for both. And with PTSD, it can come because of flashbacks and memories overwhelm. It can come because you blame yourself. This is actually quite common and not often talked about, in which you blame yourself. It's like, why didn't I fight back? It's important to know with the fight, flight, or freeze response, they now have fawn as well. Where you might fawn over the person and like, oh, you're so great, and try to make it a sweeter experience when we all know it's not. But of those, usually in your youth, when you're very young and you deal with trauma or traumatic event, a common response is to freeze. You're not taught like what's happening. So I was sexually assaulted at the age of 4 and I froze because I didn't know anything about sex. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know to run away. I didn't know to fight back. I didn't know what was going on. And for many, you may have had a similar experience and you froze. Well, my therapist let me know that you have an over 90%, it's like 95% plus likelihood if you freeze with your first traumatic event and you have complex PTSD in which multiple traumatic events happen, that your next traumatic event, there's like a 95% likelihood that you're going to freeze again if you froze the first time. So I froze at 4, and then when I was raped at the age of 12 or 13, I froze again. But I blamed myself and I wanted to bully myself. So I started starving myself. I started working out all the time. I was trying to just do anything different with my body to feel like I had some level of control. And it was really hard to love myself. So negative beliefs of myself, negative beliefs of the world. I felt like the world was unsafe. But then I just like kept trusting because I'm also neurodivergent. So that was a really interesting process. You might have difficulty managing intense emotions. This is often called meltdown in the neurodivergent circles in which I'm kind of studying my matrix. A meltdown is where you just completely have an emotional freak out. This can happen as well with PTSD, where you might be in a grocery store or a board meeting and some flashbacks and things are occurring and you just freak out and you just get them and you have a hard time dealing with the emotions because we don't teach children, and many, many children face traumas, how to deal with traumas. It's not something that we're like, here's how you deal with it. Here's how you process your emotions. These are not common things to be taught in the average home. So you might have a heightened sensitivity to sensory inputs. So I love sensory deprivation. I love to shut out the world. And there may be a desire to do that from the traumatic event because the world doesn't feel safe, and from a neurodivergent experience because the world does not feel like it makes sense. And so you just get overwhelmed by sensory input and there's too much of it. And it's not always of your great special interest. So it's like, no, thanks. You might have hypervigilance or overactive nervous system or heightened startle response. Heather scares so easy. You can ask anyone. Like my ex-husband, I was blow drying my hair once and he came in and I was like, and I had like an extreme startle response. And he was like, I am your husband. I live here. Like I live with you. Like that was like extreme, but it came from, it can come from either of these things. I'm not sure because I have both, but having PTSD may cause me to startle easy, and having neurodivergence may cause me to startle easy because with neurodivergence, I'm often really deeply inside of my own internal little worlds. And so I'm not really present with the outer world, right? With the PTSD, you might have anticipation of the unexpected happening because a traumatic, unexpected event happened, and then you might startle easily. And then you might be really hypervigilant to like look for what's safe or what's unsafe. And there can be hypervigilance with autism and neurodivergence because part of that is often masking or trying to fit in. So you might be hypervigilant to make sure, am I doing all the things? Am I making the right facial responses? Am I, oh, we're going to talk about the weather. Okay. Am I feigning interest even though I don't care about the weather at all? Oh, we're going to talk about money and baubles again. Don't care about that either. Okay. Am I acting like this is, oh, yes, that's amazing. Yeah. There can be impulse control difficulties. My brain, this happened a week or two ago, my brain thought of this amazing carrot cake at Mario's. I was thinking about my friends visiting, love it. They're coming next weekend, can't wait. And then I was like, oh, I should take them to get the piece of that carrot cake. But as soon as I put the slice of that Sicilian, Italian, delicious carrot cake in my mind, my brain would not stop, be like, carrot cake, carrot cake, carrot cake, carrot cake. I would see it and think about it. And I went and tried to give myself an alternative, lower calorie treat, and it worked for a minute. And then within 48 hours, I had that slice of cake. So you might have a really difficult time with neurodivergence and autism, getting yourself to be disciplined. It is a constant practice for Heather Feather to be disciplined. I have to constantly work with myself. And I am a very disciplined woman, but I've spent decades working on it because I know that I have impulse control issues. You might be with PTSD and complex PTSD. Actually, you would think you would become risk avoidant, but you actually might stumble towards more high risk scenarios that become, dangerous or difficult for you to deal with. You might have executive functioning difficulties. You might not be able to function the same in your job and your relationships after you have a traumatic event. You might not be the same person. And with neurodivergence, there are a lot of neurotypical things that, an example that I experience all the time is I only want to talk about what I'm interested in. And this is one of the distinctions of being neurodivergent. And there are luckily lots of things that I'm interested in, which is why women often don't get diagnosed until later in life. I'm interested in psychology. I'm interested in spirituality. I'm interested in what causes psychopaths to be psychopaths. I'm interested in, I have just curiosity of a lot of different things. I'm interested in nature. I'm interested in hiking. I'm interested in cooking. I love to cook. I love to sew. I love to create. I love to craft. And there are lots of things I'm not interested in. And I don't know in a social scenario how to be like, the executive functioning difficulty I face is I don't want to be a part of this conversation. It can increase stress because that's considered rude. Heather, don't do that. Both may have sleep issues. They might have a difficult time. So I actually have a bedtime ritual where I put Heather to bed. And I work to maintain that ritual and that discipline because it can be hard for me to sleep. It's hard to shut my brain off as a general rule. Same with a trauma. Once you get dark and you get in your bed, then it's finally you have a minute with your brain. And that's when you might start having some of these flashbacks. And both parties, both PTSD and neurodivergent parties, will do what's called stimming, which is where you might, maybe before the trauma, you didn't rub your heart, but now you have a tendency to rub your heart. Stimming is just where you do some kind of repetitive physical behavior that just makes you feel self-soothed. It makes you feel better. The distinction, so those are all shared qualities between PTSD and autism, which can sometimes cause neurodivergence to be a difficult diagnosis. With autism, there are repetitive behaviors and self-soothing through the use of routines. So not only do you do stimming, but you might be a very routine-oriented person. And I want to flesh out this distinction for myself and my understanding of this with myself and the way I experience it. I can eat leftovers every day for a month. And as a matter of fact, this is common on a lot of the autism channels that I watch. And I always thought everyone's and some people are oh, I never want leftovers. No, I need to get fresh food or whatever. As a matter of fact, I crave leftovers. When I crave a certain meal, there was this point when I got this idea of making a wedge salad at home with blue cheese dressing and walnuts and cranberries. And once I got the idea, the carrot cake, I was oh, I want that. And then I just wanted it every day for weeks. I ate that for 3 weeks, maybe 2 months. I don't know. I was so good. So I'd eat a protein with this wedge salad and I could not stop eating. It was so good. But then there's a point at which you just get sick of it. This is very common with autism too. You have a special interest, and this is unique to autism and neurodivergence. And that special interest can consume your attention. And then you might actually get rid of it and have a new special interest and it consumes your attention. So special interest is specific. Sensory sensitivities being a part of your baseline experience. So I don't like the way this tag feels. I don't like, you may just be very sensory input sensitive to a much higher degree with neurodivergence, and you may have difficulty reading neurotypical social cues. You can always subscribe to Rare Bird Medicine on YouTube. Amun.